the writer and journalist, started out at the New Statesman magazine before joining the Independent newspaper, where he won Young Columnist of the Year, as well as writing for the New York Times, the LA Times, the Guardian, Le Monde, to name but a few. He's also written several fascinating books on the war on drugs, and now this one in paperback called Lost Connections. Tell us what it's about.
There were these two kind of mysteries that were really haunting me that I wanted to understand. The first is I just turned 40, and almost every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have gone up here in Britain and across the Western world. And I want to understand why. Why is this happening to so many of us? Why is so many of us finding it so hard to get through the day? And there was a more kind of personal mystery. When I was a teenager, I'd gone to my doctor and I'd explained that I had this feeling like pain was kind of leaking out of me and I couldn't control it. I felt very ashamed of it. And my doctor told me a story that I now realise is not totally untrue, but really oversimplified. My doctor said, there's just a problem in your brain here, and all we need to do is give you drugs. And I did get some help from the drugs I was given, but I remained really depressed, and I was jacking up the dose year after year, and after 13 years of taking the maximum possible dose, I was still depressed. So I ended up, for this book, Lost Connections, going on this big journey all over the world. I travelled over 40,000 miles. I wanted to sit with the leading experts in the world about what causes these problems, people who've pioneered loads of different solutions. And the main thing I learned is there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are in our biology. Your genes can make you a bit more vulnerable, and there are real changes in your brain. But most of the factors that cause depression are not in our biology. They're in the way we're living. And once you understand that, it opens up a whole different set of solutions.
Is it so my understanding is some people are vulnerable to depression. Those people may be lucky, strangely, because actually depression saves them from having a stroke or heart attack when they're under stress. They carry the vulnerability. If they live their lives on an allotment, they're not going to get depressed. Once they engage with the world and they get stress-related problems, they plunge. So it's now you tell me if I'm wrong. It's the combination of the world and the brain. Is that right?
Yeah, for some people. And for some people, it's mostly things that are happening in their lives. So there's a mixture. I think one of the key things that unites a lot of the 9 causes of depression and anxiety that I learned about from these experts is everyone in your audience knows that you've got natural physical needs, right? Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need clean air, you need shelter. If I took them away from you, you'd be in terrible trouble really quickly. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And our culture is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today. But we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs.
David, let me bring you in.
I don't disagree in the slightest, actually. I mean, I think the thing about depression is it's an overarching term for a wide spectrum of illness. There's no doubt that people have physical and psychological manifestations of that. And in an ideal world, you know, if you do go and see your doctor and say you're depressed, then what we would like to do is to sit down, to talk with you, to understand the underlying factors, you know, those exogenous factors that really you have a marked impact on your life, and then we'd like to, you know, involve counselling and therapy and all the rest of it. The one thing I would say, and I've read your abstract, and I found it really interesting, there is a place for drugs. Oh. They're often used certainly as an adjunct. It can buy you very valuable time in people who are seriously depressed, who you're very, very worried about. But certainly drugs are not the answer in my book.
Don't you find that doctors, this is a very sweeping generalisation, actually just use drugs as a cosh because they don't have time?
No, I don't think that. One of the heroes of my book is this amazing doctor called Sam Everington. He's a doctor in East London. And he was really uncomfortable. Loads of people were coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And Sam knew a few things. Firstly, he knew that loneliness is massively rising and loneliness causes depression, right? He also knew, like me, he's not against these drugs, but he could see most of the people he was giving them to did become depressed again. He decided to pioneer a different approach. One day, a woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who'd been shut away with terrible depression and anxiety for 7 years. I got to know her quite well later. He said to Lisa, don't worry, I'll keep giving you the drugs if you want. I'm also going to prescribe something else. There was just scrubland behind the doctor's surgery. He said, what I want you to do is come and turn out a couple of times a week with a group of other depressed and anxious people. I'm going to come too, because I've been a bit anxious, and we're going to figure something out to do together. The first time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But they decided they were going to do something. They decided to learn gardening, right? They started to get their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant.
Connecting with the
Exactly, but more importantly, an even deeper form of connection.
Social.
They started to form a tribe, exactly what you're intuiting. There was a study in Norway, a very similar programme, found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. Yeah. And this is the key thing I saw all over the world in my research. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the reasons why we feel this way, because our pain makes sense, right? These are signals. They mean something. They're telling us something's missing.
But isn't the body the body's faulty here, isn't it? Because it's overreacting.
Well, I mean, in the old days, we used to talk about sort of reactive depression and endogenous depression. But certainly, you know, I certainly see people have social isolation who feel desperately lonely. I learned last week that there are more over 65-year-olds than under 16s in this country for the first time. So we've got this whole group of elderly people who feel socially isolated, have nothing to do, no purpose in life.
They're retired. They don't feel they have any value or worth.
No value. And also, you lose your title because everyone always says to you, what do you do for a living? And of course, the minute you don't do anything, you're no longer useful.
You're not validated anyway.
I think you're so right. And part of the problem is, if we tell people an entirely biological story, we say it's just a problem in your brain, what we're saying to them is this terrible pain you're in doesn't mean anything. It's like a glitch.
So in answer to your question, Jeremy,
true.
I think you do get chemical changes in your brain. But of course, it depends what the trigger is. If you're socially isolated, you don't see anyone, you feel you have no meaning in your life and life isn't worth living, you will have chemical changes in your brain.
Of course.
Equally,
Which do make it hard.
the other way around is true.
I think you've gone exactly right. And if you look at these 9 causes of depression and anxiety, for which there's really strong scientific evidence that I write about in Lost Connections, the key solutions are dealing with them. So, for example, if you've had a severely traumatic childhood, I had experienced some very extreme acts of abuse as a child. If you're given places where you can talk about that and release your shame around that, that leads to a really huge fall in depression and anxiety.
Talking is the most important thing. I actually had a nervous breakdown about a year after I moved to London when I first came down to Fleet Street, and I ended up in a nursing home in Regent's Park for about 10 days.
I didn't know that.
No, well, why should you?
Well,
And I then had to rebuild myself and rebuild my life. Unfortunately, I had a very good doctor, and I ended up having therapy for about 8 years, which really, really helped me. So all the time that I was, you know, a very high-achieving columnist, you
were in therapy.
I was in therapy.
Did you use? This was in the 80s.
Yes,
I'm just thinking that's before they brought in all the newfangled Prozacs and all that. So you would have had the proper heavy metal.
No, I didn't.
What, you mean like lithium?
Well, whatever that stuff was.
medical term.
Amine oxidase inhibitors.
Oh my God! Did you have that stuff?
No, I had none of that.
Right.
It was basically talking.
Let me ask Johann. I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
I went through your stellar career. This is more of a personal question to you, and everyone knows that you then had a bit of a juddering moment when you were caught plagiarising, and it's a long time ago and all that. But I watched it from a distance, knowing that you'd had mental health problems, and I thought this is just about the worst possible thing that can happen to you, because it's hit you exactly where you find your worth, which is in your journalism.
No, some of the audience won't know what this is a reference to. So in some of the articles I'd written, I used some things that had been said to other journalists as if they'd been said directly to me, which is an awful thing to do, really terrible, and I rightly paid a big price for it. So I've never sat here and said, oh, people should feel sorry for me, or talked about how that felt for me, because when you screw up, you should pay a big price, right? And I did pay a big price, and that's quite right. With this book, obviously, all the quotes are on the book's website.
Yeah, but it's more about how you dealt with it yourself, because I think you've mentioned, you know, clearly you have a fragile mind, like a lot of us, and that's not a good thing to happen to you.
Essentially, in the aftermath of thinking more deeply about depression, partly in relation to that, but partly more deeply, there's one person who really helped me think about this differently. I went to interview this academic called Dr. Brett Ford, and in some ways what she's taught me was so simple that we might think from it as stupid. She did this study. She wanted to figure out, if you wanted to make yourself happier, if you decided, any of you guys decided you were going to spend, let's say, 2 hours a day trying to be happier, would you actually become happier, right? And they studied this in 4 countries, the US, Taiwan, Russia and Japan. And what they found at first seems really weird. In the US, I'm pretty sure we'd be the same, I'll tell you why. If you try to make yourself deliberately happier, you do not become happier. In the other countries, if you try to become happier, you do. And they were like, what's going on? How can that be? What they discovered is, in the US, if you try to make yourself happier, generally you do something for yourself. You buy something, you work harder, you show off on Instagram. In the other places, generally, if you try to make yourself happier, you do something for your friends and your family. And I found that, so they have a kind of instinctively collective idea of what happiness is, and we have an instinctively individual idea. And I realised, before, when I started to feel depressed, generally, I would do something for myself. I would show off, I would earn more money, and now, and I still feel those painful feelings come sometimes. I very consciously, I'm not like Oprah, I can't turn up and give someone a car, but I just leave my phone at home and go and listen to someone else and try to do something for someone else. And there's a lot of evidence that shifting from this thinking about yourself all the time to thinking about other people is a really powerful antidepressant.